Okay, hi guys, back again for the last video on the biogeochemical cycles. So hopefully you finished off your notes on the carbon cycle. Remember you had to finish off human impacts and also how you can manage the carbon cycle more sustainably. So hopefully you've managed to do that successfully. So we're on to the last one, which is the phosphorus cycle. So got a few things for you to do in preparation for our live teams lesson later this week. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll talk a bit about the phosphorus cycle, why it's different to the other cycles, why phosphorus is important. I'll show you some of the resources on the Moodle site which you can have a look at before our next lesson, and then I'm going to draw out the phosphorus cycle. It's a fairly straightforward cycle. You haven't got any of the bacteria to remember the name of, like in the nitrogen cycle. So yeah, put a title of the phosphorus cycle in your notes, and the first thing to say about the phosphorus cycle is it's an incredibly slow cycle. Whereas something like the nitrogen cycle, you've got bacteria working away, you've got nitrate being leached from soils, carbon cycle, you've got respiration and photosynthesis. These are quite fast processes. The the phosphorus cycle is a very slow cycle. Now there's two reasons why it's very slow. So the first reason is that it doesn't exist in a gaseous form. So there's no phosphorus in the atmosphere, unlike obviously nitrogen and carbon. And lots of the atmospheric processes happen quickly. So there's no atmospheric store, if you like. It's not strictly speaking true. You can get sort of dust storms. There's a lot of phosphorus contained in rocks. So if you have sort of high winds and dust storms, that can sort of bring dust containing phosphorus out into the oceans. Sometimes you get that from the Sahara Desert, but there's no actual gaseous form. The second reason why it's a very slow cycle is that it's not very soluble. So it's actually normally the limiting factor for plant growth. So it's the excess phosphates, if you put those into a water body, a river or a lake, that cause huge algal blooms, because usually phosphorus is in quite short supply. So why is phosphorus important? Well, it's important for lots of biological processes. It's a component of ATP, some of you might have heard of, those of you doing biology. It's an important component of bones, proteins, etc., DNA. So it's a really important biological molecule. Anyway, so that's phosphorus and why it's important. So the phosphorus cycle, and there's some quite nice stuff on the Moodle site to do with phosphorus, so you could have a look at that. There's quite a nice BBC News article, and I think I've put this in your resource booklet. I haven't got the up-to-date version, but I'm pretty sure it's in your resource booklet, and it's called The Insatiable Demand for, I think it's The Insatiable Demand for Phosphorus, something like that. Anyway, that would be a good one to read. Phosphorus and mining phosphates for fertiliser is absolutely fundamental to food production globally, and phosphates are in quite short supply. You'll learn a bit more about that when we look at the human impacts on the cycle. So have a look at that article, that BBC News article about the world's insatiable hunger for phosphates. And then on the PowerPoint that's on the Moodle site, the PowerPoint that's called the Biogeochemical Cycles, the phosphorus stuff starts on slide 12. You could have a quick look through those first few slides of 12, 13, 14. A lot of that stuff we're going to talk about in the lesson on later this week. But yeah, have a look through maybe the first 3 or 4 slides. There is a really interesting story about an island in the Pacific called Nauru. I don't want to spoil the surprise, but there's a really nice story about that on slide 16, and there's a very nice video which I'd like you to watch, but you can perhaps watch that after we've done the live lesson. Anyway, so we're going to talk a bit about the phosphorus cycle and the main processes, and probably the easiest way to explain that again is to do another diagram. So we're going to do the same as we did last time. If you've got some A3 paper, that would be brilliant. Otherwise you'll have to do it on A4. It's going to work best in landscape. So grab some pens, grab some paper. I'm going to move the camera around to a position where you can see a bit more clearly. So if you bear with me for a second. Apologies for the mess that's on the floor. So let's see if we can draw this one out. Oops, there we go. Okay. Alright, see if we can zoom in. I wish I had a slightly better whiteboard to draw on, but this I'm afraid is as good as you're going to get. Okay, I think that is probably about as good as we're going to get that. All right, so again, this diagram is in cross section, and I've drawn a few things on already. So over on the left hand side you have a mountain range. You've got some plants here with quite an extensive root network, and you've got some kind of food chain that's happening here. We've got some excretory wastes, we've got a dead animal, and over here we've got the seas and oceans. So what's the starting point? Well, the starting point I think we could talk about is how plants take up phosphates. So phosphates need to be in a soluble form. So what you can have on your diagram, going down from the excretory wastes and going down from sort of dead animals and dead plants, you can have a box here, dead organic matter. Okay, so the dead organic matter in soils is in fact a store of phosphates, and then what happens is those decompose, microbes, soil microbes, put them into a form that can be absorbed by plants. So we can have some decomposition. Again, I'm sure you can write this out a lot better than me. It's quite hard writing on this board. So decomposition by soil biota and soil microbes, putting those phosphates into a soluble form that plants can take up. Now, plants actually find it quite hard to absorb phosphates. As I say, they're not very soluble, and they often have an extensive root network, a symbiotic relationship with what are called mycorrhizal fungi. It's a bit of a pig to spell this one. M-Y-C-O-R-R-H-I-Z-A-L. So mycorrhizal fungi. So you can actually buy these in a garden centre, and it's like a white powder. You can actually put it on the roots of plants, and it helps plants develop a root network. So mycorrhizal fungi exist in the soil. Plants have a symbiotic relationship with them, and it helps the plant to establish a much larger root network. So those help plants take up and absorb phosphates. So we could have absorption written on here. I'm running out of space, as you can see already. Haven't really thought this one through, but you can write out absorption there, and plants taking those up. Okay. So they move along food chains, as we can see. Plants, animals eating plants, etc. Excretory waste down into dead organic matter, decomposition and absorption. Okay, now a lot of, again, there's no atmospheric store here, so no gaseous form to put on. If you wanted to, you could have sort of, you know, some dust particles maybe being blown into the sea. I guess we could put, I'm going to put some sand dunes over here. It's a bit of a stretch, but I'm going to have a few sand dunes with a bit of marram grass. I'm sure you could set this out a lot better than me. And maybe some of the wind blowing some of the dust particles into the sea. But I say, generally speaking, no atmospheric store of phosphates. Now in the oceans, a lot of these processes are really quite important, and what you have to imagine in oceans, the base of the marine food web of phytoplankton, these microscopic creatures, you get 20 million on a teaspoon. So phytoplankton are very important, and phytoplankton live in the first few meters, first maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 meters of the oceans, but particularly close to the surface, because that's what's called the photic zone. That's where the light is, and these are plants, basically phytoplankton, and they absorb phosphates that's dissolved in sea water. Of course, the problem in oceans is that when everything dies, and all the excretory wastes always end up descending down to the bottom of the oceans, and that's what happens to a lot of phosphates. Things die, excretory wastes, and then you've got this gradual raining down of all these phosphates towards the ocean floor. And unless there's any sort of upwelling, like off the coast of Peru, or some way of those getting back up to the surface, phosphates are often in very limited supply in ocean waters, and it's often a limiting factor. So if you want, you can draw some fish. It's always nice to draw a few fish, isn't it, on these diagrams. And we can have a few dead things, I think, sort of, you know, heading down to the ocean floor, etc. So again, we have a build-up, a bit similar to the carbon cycle, where we had the build-up of sediments on the seafloor forming rocks like limestone. You've got a very similar thing happening with the phosphorus cycle. You've got sort of dead fish. Think about phosphates, remember we said are important in bones. So you've got lots of sort of phosphates building up on the ocean floor and forming rocks eventually. So we've got a sedimentation happening here. sedimentation, and forming rocks like apatite. There are lots of different rocks containing phosphates, but apatite is a good example. And you think, well, what happens to that? Well, actually what happens is those rocks form over millions of years. How are plants going to absorb that phosphate? Well, actually, you can think about why the cycle is so slow. You actually have to wait for these rocks that are formed on the seabed through sort of plate tectonics at a plate boundary for uplift to occur and for those rocks to be brought up to the surface. And that can obviously take millions of years for that to occur. And then when they do reach the surface in sort of mountain ranges, places like the Andes, then those rocks could eventually be eroded. So we could put erosion on here. And as those rocks are then eroded, those phosphates once again become available. It might sound far-fetched, but bear in mind, think about something like the Himalayas. As India moved towards Asia, in between India and Asia there was a sea called the Tethys Sea, and as India collided with Asia hundreds of millions of years ago, all those rocks on the bottom of the Indian Ocean were pushed up into the Himalayas. It's common to find fossils of sort of fish, you know, many thousands of meters above sea level. So mountain ranges often contain rocks that maybe hundreds of millions of years ago were actually on the seabed. But obviously that's a very slow process of uplift and then eventually erosion, and those phosphates become available again. The only other thing I think left on our diagram to put is seabirds that consume fish. You can put a few of those on if you want, and let's have them flying maybe over here towards the mountain range. And I haven't left much space here, but you can have those seabirds flying over the mountains, and their droppings are incredibly rich in phosphates. And there is a name for that, and they're called guano. So G-U-A-N-O. So guano are the name, was the name given to the bird droppings that are very, very rich in phosphates, and those are often mined, but we'll talk a bit more about that when we do the human impacts on the carbon cycle. So it's quite an unusual cycle, no bacteria involved. We've got some important symbiotic relationships with the mycorrhizal fungi, but most of the other things happening are very, very sort of slow processes, and that's the phosphorus cycle. So hopefully that makes sense. Have a go, please, at drawing it out before our lesson on later this week, and also have a look at the resources that I outlined earlier. Okay, thanks guys. Cheers.